super secure. Yes. So our next group of panelists are a mix of partnership-based and researcher-led, all wellness related. And we have 4 groups that are going to be presenting. And again, 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So our first group is Yukon Status of Women Council and Safe at Home Project, entitled Addressing the Unintended Consequences of Pandemic-Related, Housing-Related Policies Experienced by Unhoused or Precariously Housed Women and Families in Whitehorse. So that's the panelists for that group are Khulud Baig, and who will be participating virtually, and Ashley Hope from the Yukon Status of Women Council. Our next group is a Yukon University project that is entitled The Impacts of COVID-19 on Yukon's Frontline Healthcare Workers. It is a researcher-led project by Yukon University, and we have Lyra Smith, Health Research Chair of YSPOR, which is the Yukon Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, got it, Yukon U. Mark Christopher, Research Assistant at Yukon U. Michelle Leach, Scientific Director at YSPOR, Yukon U. And our third group is Yukon Status of Women Council and UNBC project, and that is entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on Livelihoods and Well-Being of Women in the Yukon Toward a Resilient and Inclusive Recovery, partnership-based project. And that is Yukon Status of Women Council and Fiona McPhail at University of Northern British Columbia. And the panelists for that are Asia Mason and Ashley Hope, Yukon Status of Women Council, and Fiona McPhail, UNBC. And Fiona will be joining us virtually. The fourth project is a Lakehead University project entitled The Impacts of COVID-19 Pandemic on the Health and Well-Being of Educators in Yukon. It's a researcher-led project, and our presenters are Dana Corton, PhD candidate in health sciences at Lakehead University. And so I'm going to invite the groups to come up or do their presentations. We've organized the chairs a little bit so that you can not have the presentation in your face. So we'll just give everybody a moment to come on up and get organized. And the Yukon Status of Women Council Safe at Home project is going to be first, and then the Yukon University project, Impacts of COVID-19. You love how long all of the titles are. I think there's something to be said for brevity when it comes to research titles. So I'm going to let you guys get organized. Who's going first?
Hey everyone, I'm not Ashley Hope, I'm Asia Mason. Just a slight shift in the agenda. Can everybody on Zoom see the presentation okay? Got some thumbs up? Nice. So, yeah, really catchy titles, hey? Like 10 billion words. I tried to shorten it just to make it a little bit less overwhelming because the number of relateds in our title is a bit excessive. In effect, this is a project, a collaboration project, which we want to lean into and emphasize as many of the panelists describe what it is that they've been doing. Collaborations are key. For us, this was a collaboration between the Yukon Status Women Council and Safe at Home Society. as well as Khulud Baig. And Khulud, who is online and will be joining midway through the presentation, has an extensive amount of experience doing policy analysis and research in support of homelessness for women at multiple levels. So our project aims are fairly complex. In essence, we want to get a sense of the housing policy landscape in Whitehorse specifically, but that doesn't mean it can't apply to broader spaces in the Yukon. We want to understand the impacts of these policies on the lived experiences of women in particular. And ultimately, especially for folks in the room or online who are in positions of policy making, development, analysis, and decision making, we want to provide you a framework that can help support that process in a way that's human rights based, but also intersectional. So I'm just going to step back for a sec and give some context, and we're going to see that we've already heard this theme throughout what this morning's panelists were talking about, and we're going to continue hearing about this theme throughout the day. And that is that the quality of data in the Yukon territory when it comes to socioeconomic anythings is really, really low. In turn, that makes it really challenging for folks to make evidence-informed decisions that are inclusive of the folks who are in the margins of the margins. That applies to housing, that applies to gender-based violence, it applies to any issue that has particular impacts on folks who aren't captured in our normal quantitative data nets. So I'm just going to let that sink in, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into what we're talking about when we say data gaps. So the flow of this project is that we built questions with respect to housing. Is that we built questions with respect to housing and the impacts of policies with folks in our community. So this is a bottom-up driven participatory action research-based project where the questions themselves are developed with and by the people who are most impacted by those issues. There's also a photo voice component for this project that will be announced and presented when the whole report is finished in August. We've acquired housing policies and have built a framework to analyze those policies through, and that's what we're going to be zooming in on today with Khulud. So again, what constitutes quality data? We hear this word intersectional all the time, and we don't unpack that in a way that's actually practicable. An intersectional analysis means that we are identifying those aspects of a person's identity, that first gray circle around the yellow person in the middle, things like ethnicity, gender, age, their housing status, their geographic location. These are what we're talking about when we're referring to aspects of identity. An intersectional analysis also interrogates the ways that those aspects of identity combine in unique ways and how they're informed by the institutions and structures around them, things like policies, economic forces, legal structures. When we don't have disaggregated data or access to disaggregated data, when we can't tell how many Indigenous women are affected by the lack of access to housing, we're invisibilizing those people, but in turn, we're also amplifying those systems of power. I'm going to give a really brief example of what we're talking about. Gender-based violence in the Yukon, for example, and this can apply to housing as well, is profoundly underreported. This applies to considerations around Indigenous women's access to housing as well, because it is incredibly risky for Indigenous women to be captured within those quantitative institutional colonial data nets because their children might be apprehended if they don't provide them with housing that is considered safe. The point here we're trying to make is that folks who constitute those yellow dots are not captured in the data that's collected through those kinds of administrative processes, census data, quantitative data that Ashley Hope is going to talk a little bit more about later on. In turn, and I don't think you can see, it's unfortunately hidden at the bottom there, the response systems are in turn not informed by the yellow dots. There are no yellow pieces in what we've built here as representative of the structures and systems. That's the drive home. I'm now going to pass it over to Khulud to talk about the policy framework development process. And I'll take it after Khulud is done describing what she's done.
Awesome. Background and understanding of what exactly is what that we try to accomplish when we do policy analysis through a gendered lens. And as Asia's already touched upon it briefly, gender analysis is many times and oftentimes making the invisible visible. In the housing and homelessness world, we often talk about how women's homelessness or how gender diverse people's homelessness is invisible, which means that it doesn't necessarily show up in the at those points in the systems where data is collected. Oftentimes, systems are not safe enough for women to access and for them to find supports in, and they try to organize their lives and their navigation in a way in which they don't have to interact with systems that are likely going to expose them to harm. So one of the approach that we took with our policy analysis framework development was using a right to adequate housing framework, which is already articulated in the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, and layering that with a World Health Organization gender mainstreaming framework. And gender mainstreaming really is how policy responds to gendered impacts and gendered needs. So using these two frameworks helps us to get at that intersectional point between the right to housing as it is articulated and as it shows up or as it serves women and gender diverse people, and how well does any certain written policy on paper respond to that intersection. The hope really is to see how well are the pillars of right to adequate housing, and there are 7 of them that I'll just touch upon in the next couple of slides, are being met specifically for women and gender diverse people. And so far, the analysis really has been looking at policies as they are on paper. So the analysis piece, the action piece, the impact piece is going to come from the lived experience expertise. And the final report is going to combine both of those components. But my part of the work really is focusing on how policies are written and how well do they account for gendered realities and diverse realities in the writing of it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the right to adequate housing, as articulated in the covenant, the United Nations covenant, is very specifically about how adequate housing is not just 4 walls and a roof. That to call something adequate housing, there's these principles that need to be taken account for. So, we talk about security of tenure, this idea that somebody can exist safely in their location or what they call home without being threatened by evictions, without being threatened by having to leave, without not being given notices or being told exactly what their tenure looks like. So security of tenure and a human rights approach to tenure is a really critical component to adequate housing. The second one is availability, and this is availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. Housing that is void of availability of services, whether that is support services for people that need them, whether that is just like materials needed to renovate and build housing that serves your need, whether it's like close proximity to facilities that people need to access when they're living in housing. All of that forms critical components of adequate housing. Habitability is how safe is it to exist in that unit that you're in? Are you safe from like weather elements? Are you safe from other threats, especially really important for women and gender diverse people? It's not just about getting them a unit. Is that unit actually ensuring their safety? Are they actually safe from threats to their security and well-being? There's accessibility, particularly important for folks that are experiencing any form of visible or invisible disability. Is their housing unit built to support them and their lifestyle, to make sure that they have everything that they need to live in a dignified way? The location, again, is all about, is it situated close to everything that you need to live your life? Is it situated close to your food sources? Is it situated close to your community supports? Do you have access to transit and transportation infrastructure? Forms a part of adequate housing. And then cultural adequacy, really important, really critical, is the housing meeting the cultural needs of the people that are living in that housing, whether that is use of local materials, whether that is other important ways of living that are incorporated or form a part of housing, whether that's collective living or intergenerational living. We see all of that come up as significantly important to the right to housing. Next slide, please. So we've layered that right to housing framework in our policy analysis with the second component, which is the gender responsive assessment scale that has been put together by the World Health Organization specifically for healthcare, but we've adapted it to meet our needs in terms of the housing system. And we've created these 4 levels in our policy analysis framework where we look at a policy and we try to assess whether if it's gender blind, gender sensitive, gender sorry, I'm just gonna like quickly go forward. If you can just move the slide, Asia, just so that I can review them, and then I'll come back to this one. So gender blind, gender sensitive, gender specific, and gender transformative. Thank you so much. You can go back to the first one. So gender blind is like a lot of housing policy, and this is not just at the territorial level, but in my experience, policies at municipal level and national level are often written in gender blind ways, which is essentially to assume that a certain policy is going to impact and be experienced by everyone in the same way. And it ignores specific gender norms, rules, and relations that make experiences for women and gender diverse people unique. So as we work through policy analysis, we often find, particularly in housing policy, that a lot of housing policy is written with the assumption that the policy impacts are going to be same across the board, whether it's for women, for women, or for gender diverse people. A gender sensitive policy considers or is aware that there could be differences in the impacts and context of how people experience a certain policy, but it does not go far enough to actually address or actually make significant differences. So this is when we acknowledge, for example, that a homelessness shelter is experienced differently by men versus by women. And that acknowledgement kind of shows up in policy, but the policy really doesn't go far enough to address how the system needs to be altered or changed, or a different policy needs to be written to better accommodate women and gender diverse people. Next slide, please. Gender specific really is the next step, where not only are gender norms, roles, and relations considered and acknowledged, but also like specific needs of women and men are acknowledged, and they show up in some ways in the way that policy is written. So this could be when specific provisions are made in a policy to cater to women and gender diverse people, or to cater to their needs specifically. Gender specific policies are really like on one of the ways through which a policy can be acknowledging of the entire context of women and gender diverse people. The 4th level is gender transformative policy, which is essentially like when we go beyond that and start addressing the entire system that formulates gender roles and how it impacts people and how it makes a difference in people's lives. So that's like when you get to root causes and a policy actually gets to how women and gender diverse people's realities are not just addressed, but create a pathway towards change. Next slide, please. So far, the preliminary findings that we've looked at, and I've kind of spoken to this briefly, show us that many housing policies, and we are looking at territorial documents largely, are written in ways that are gender blind. And writing in gender blind ways mean that policy is not really addressing the invisible needs of women and the realities of women and gender diverse people. We're also finding that in the human rights framework, habitability, which is one of the aspects of safety and protection from elements and other threats, is something that is often ignored and doesn't really show up in plans that we've assessed so far, which again I find is interesting because that is an aspect that really impacts what constitutes adequate housing for women and gender diverse people. It's also interesting that when it comes to aspects of Indigenous self-governance and plans and provisions that are made for Indigenous self-governing nations, we find that the mention of Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people is often lacking, particularly when it comes to their ownership of land, their ownership of housing, their ownership of property, and so on and so forth. So again, the intersection helps us identify where the gap is and where the missing links are. Next slide, please. I'll pass
Thank
it
you.
back to Asia to kind of like bring us to the end of this. And thank you so much for
Totally.
listening to me.
Thank you, Khulud. That's so awesome. We want to leave you with a few contemplations. So if you can snap a picture of this, the last point is the most important. Given that there are fundamental gendered data gaps in the Yukon territory, how is it that when you develop policies, make decisions with really lofty goals, transformative goals, how are you measuring the impact of those decisions and plans if you don't have access to disaggregated data? If you can't measure the number of Indigenous women who are impacted by that particular issue, housing or otherwise. Thank you so much, everyone.
Goodness, geesh, thank you. I think that was really impactful, and thank you for leaving us with that contemplation.